Imagine waking up after a stormy Texas night, thinking the danger had passed, only to hear a terrified bellow cut through the dawn. Out by the muddy barn, Katie Morgan faced every farmer's nightmare. Her prized dairy cow cornered, a monstrous python coiled to strike, and between them, her loyal German shepherd Duke, battered, limping, but standing his ground against a threat nobody believed could exist here. What happened next would test the limits of courage, loyalty, and a town's willingness to choose hope over fear. Stay with us, because this is the story of a dog who refused to give up, and the woman who learned that sometimes the hardest fight isn't against the storm, but against the voices telling you to run. At dawn, after a night where thunder seemed to split the world apart, the muddy fields outside Katie Morgan's farmhouse still glistened with the last beads of rain. The air was thick, heavy, humming with the aftershock of the Texas storm that had battered the little town for hours. Somewhere close, a frantic bellow shattered the uneasy silence, the kind of sound that shot straight through the chest, equal parts fear and desperation. Katie was already awake, the storm having chased sleep from her bed hours before. Her hands were still shaking as she pulled on rubber boots, the cold from the floor biting her toes. Outside, the wind still carried the smell of wet earth and electric tension, but nothing prepared her for what she saw as she rounded the corner of the barn. Her heart lurched. There, at the far end of a makeshift pen half swallowed by mud, her prized dairy cow, Daisy, was pressed against the fence, eyes wide with terror, nostrils flaring. Between Daisy and something enormous and sinuous, her German shepherd, Duke, was planted, hackles raised, his whole body taut as a wire. A python, thicker than Katie's forearm, mottled with an unnatural yellowish sheen, was coiled, head lifted, tongue flicking the air. Duke lunged, barking, keeping himself between the snake and Daisy, his paws skidding in the muck. For a moment, the scene froze. Rain spitting, sky still bruised, cow bawling, dog refusing to budge, and the monstrous reptile inching closer. Katie's breath caught in her throat. In 10 years on this land, she'd never seen anything like it. A python, here in Texas, after a storm like this? Her mind raced. Maybe someone's escaped pet, maybe dumped. Either way, it was a nightmare come to life. She fumbled for her phone, hands slipping on the wet screen, dialing animal control out of instinct. The line rang and rang before a groggy voice answered. "We're an hour out, ma'am. Roads are flooded. We'll get there as soon as—" Katie cut them off. An hour? Daisy might not last another 5 minutes. And Duke, her stubborn, loyal Duke, a retired K9 with a limp and a heart as big as Texas, wasn't going to let that snake pass, no matter what it cost him. She shouted, "Duke, come!" But he ignored her, barking so fiercely his voice went hoarse. The python recoiled, then lashed out, jaws snapping inches from his face. Duke danced back, muddy fur flying, but he didn't run. Instead, he circled the python, teeth bared, herding it away from Daisy with every desperate leap. The cow's hooves slipped in the mud, fence creaking dangerously under her weight. Katie's mind raced with memories of her late husband. He'd always said Duke was born with a badge in his blood. But she saw the tremor in the dog's injured leg, the wildness in his eyes. One wrong move. Lightning crackled somewhere far off, followed by a rolling growl of thunder. The python seemed to grow bolder, curling tighter, hissing. Duke fainted, barking louder, trying to draw it away. Rain pelted harder, making the world slick and chaotic. Katie felt the panic building. Her hands trembled, vision narrowing. For a split second, she considered grabbing her husband's old shotgun from the truck. But she hesitated. Daisy was right there and Duke was everywhere at once. One missed shot, and she could lose everything she loved in a heartbeat. Instead, she grabbed a shovel half sunk in the mud and crept forward, keeping the pen between her and the snake. "Easy, Duke. Easy, buddy." Her voice shook. The python struck again, hitting Duke in the flank. He yelped but didn't retreat, lunging at the snake's tail, teeth scraping scales. Katie screamed, swinging the shovel, missing by a foot. The snake recoiled, eyes glinting in the dim light. Duke seized the moment, driving the python a few feet further from Daisy. Mud flew, paws slipping, his body a blur of fear and fury. "Duke, that's enough! Come!" But he was deaf to everything but the threat. The cow's bellow rose higher, desperate, drawing out the moment like something from a nightmare. Katie's thoughts spun out. She was alone, no help coming, and if she lost Duke now, she'd never forgive herself. Suddenly, the python coiled, gathering its strength. Katie saw its muscles ripple, realized it was about to strike again, this time not in warning, but for the kill. Time slowed. She screamed Duke's name, ran forward, swinging the shovel with all her might. The blade hit the ground inches from the snake's head, sending up a spray of muck. The python recoiled, but Duke darted in, teeth snapping, and for a heartbeat, the two were locked together. Dog and snake, predator and protector, in a dance as old as time. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. Katie's heart hammered in her ears. Every instinct screamed to run, but she planted her feet and yelled, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. Across the field, lights flickered on in distant farmhouses. A new day was coming. But here in the muddy pen, the old war between fear and courage was playing out in the rain. As the storm finally began to break and the gray light of morning crept across the land, Duke stood tall between the python and the cow, battered but unyielding. Katie realized, with a mix of terror and awe, that something had changed in her loyal companion. What had awakened in Duke that night? And what price would they all pay before sunrise? By the time Katie finally managed to wrestle Daisy into the barn, dawn had crept up, casting the fields in a bruised, yellow glow. Her hands were numb, mud caked up to her knees, and her heart hammered with each shaky breath. Duke limped beside her, caked in filth but still alert, never taking his eyes off the darkness behind the pen where the python had last slithered. Katie barely had time to catch her breath before the first headlights flickered down the gravel road. Trucks and beat-up sedans pulled in, one after another, engines grumbling and doors slamming as neighbors spilled out, voices sharp and anxious in the cold morning air. Jim Parker was the first to stride over, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, his face carved by decades of sun and wind. He carried an old Winchester under one arm, eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Right behind him, Mrs. Nguyen, tiny, silver-haired, wrapped in a raincoat, came hustling up, clutching a flashlight and a first aid kit, her concern radiating across the yard. "What the hell happened?" Jim barked, gaze sweeping from Katie to the trembling cow, to Duke, and then to the muddy tracks that showed just how close disaster had come. "It was a python. Big one," Katie said, voice trembling with exhaustion. "Duke kept it off Daisy. I tried to get animal control. Roads are a mess." "A python?" someone called from the cluster of neighbors now gathering at the fence. Murmurs rippled. "Ain't no damn pythons in Texas unless someone's been keeping something they shouldn't." More people joined. Teen brothers in camo jackets, an older couple with coffee mugs clutched tight, even Mr. Briggs from 3 farms over, who rarely left his land unless it was for church or disaster. The debate erupted almost immediately. Jim jacked a shell into his rifle and growled, "We ought to find that snake and put it down before it gets another chance. It's dangerous, a threat to every animal and kid out here." Mrs. Nguyen stepped between him and the gate, voice firm. Wait, that's not a wild animal's fault. Someone brought it here, and shooting at it with all these animals around. What if you hit Duke? Or Daisy? Jim scoffed. That dog should have been kept inside. Katie, you know better than to let him run loose with a threat like that out there. And now we got a cow in shock, a dog that could be dying, and a snake on the loose. Don't you dare blame Duke, Katie shot back, the exhaustion snapping into anger. If it weren't for him, that python would have killed Daisy. He risked his life. As the voices rose, the tension became thick enough to cut. Rain started falling again, light at first, then heavier, the storm not quite done with them yet. The group pressed in, half to gawk, half to judge. People were scared, some for the animals, others for their own safety, and a few, Katie sensed, just looking for someone to blame. A young man in a sheriff's windbreaker, Chris, the volunteer fireman, pushed his way to the front. Let's not make things worse. We need to stay calm. Animal control's still coming, right? He looked at Katie, who nodded, barely able to speak. Lightning exploded nearby, blinding white and impossibly loud. Everyone ducked reflexively. For a split second, it felt like the storm had reached straight into their hearts and twisted. The old oak at the edge of Katie's field caught the brunt, splitting with a deafening crack. Steam hissed where rain met scorched bark. That was all it took for chaos to break loose. Two of the teenage boys leapt the fence, rifles raised. Jim started shouting orders, and a few others circled the barn, peering into every shadow. Mrs. Nguyen gripped Katie's arm, whispering, "Let them search, but don't let them take over. You know Duke best. He'll listen to you before he listens to any of them." Katie's mind spun. She watched as Duke struggled to his feet, ears pricked, ready to throw himself back into the fray if the snake returned. Mud streaked his side, and blood trickled from a fresh bite wound, but his eyes burned with purpose. Daisy, meanwhile, still trembled, her flanks heaving as Katie stroked her nose with shaky hands. Chris corralled the teens, warning, "If you fire in this weather, with these animals around, you could hit anything. Everybody, let's just hold off." But fear had a way of feeding itself, and the group was fracturing, some itching to hunt, others frozen by the thought of what else might be out there. Jim turned on Katie. "Are you sure that snake's gone? You got any other surprises for us? Because I tell you, if that python comes back and someone gets hurt..." Katie squared her shoulders. "You want to help? Then trust me and trust Duke. He knows what he's doing. But I need you all to stay calm, keep the animals safe, and let animal control handle the rest. Please." For a moment, no one moved. Rain hammered the barn roof, the smell of ozone sharp in the air. Finally, Mrs. Nguyen raised her flashlight and nodded. "She's right. Duke is the only reason Daisy's still alive." With that, some tension broke, but it was clear the storm inside the community was just beginning. Katie knew the real battle wasn't just against the snake. It was against the doubt and fear now swirling among her neighbors. And somewhere, out in the drenched fields, the python was still at large, its presence twisting the town's nerves tighter with every passing minute. The sun had finally clawed its way above the ragged horizon, but the Morgan farm was still cloaked in an uneasy hush. Animal control arrived, late, mud-splattered, exhausted, just as Katie finished wrangling Daisy into a makeshift stall. The battered animal control truck rattled to a stop near the barn, and two officers stepped out, hauling a battered animal crate and heavy tongs. They were strangers, faces drawn with the stress of a night full of storm calls and flooded roads. Neighbors pressed in around the scene, forming a semicircle of muddy boots and wary stares. Duke, limping but defiant, stood as a silent sentinel at Katie's side, fur still bristling with adrenaline. One of the officers crouched to examine Duke's side, whistling low. "You're lucky, boy. That bite's deep, but not fatal." The other officer peered around the pen, flashlight beam dancing over trampled grass and bloody smears in the mud. "Where's the python now?" Katie's voice came out thin, her nerves worn to the bone. "Last I saw, it slid off behind the barn, toward the creek. But it could be anywhere." Chris, the young volunteer fireman, pointed to a thick tangle of brush. "Found its track. Big as my arm. Gotta be close." The officers exchanged looks, then moved with practiced urgency, scanning every shadow, every pool of standing water. After tense minutes, a cry went up. One officer had spotted the python, sluggish but still menacing, curled beneath a tangle of roots. The neighbors fell back, breath caught, as the officers moved in. Katie clutched Duke's collar, trying to keep him from surging forward again. It was over in a flash, a quick, dangerous dance of tongs, hisses, and curses as the python lashed out. But the officers prevailed, wrestling it into the crate with shaking hands. The crowd exhaled in collective relief. The python's head banged against the bars, eyes cold and unblinking. As the adrenaline faded, the real pain set in. Daisy's sides heaved, sweat streaking her hide. Duke, head low, trembled as Katie knelt to examine the wound on his side. She pressed a clean rag against the bite, blood blooming through the fabric, and whispered, "Easy, Duke. It's over. You did good, boy." But Duke's eyes were haunted, unfocused, lost in some private hell. Around them, the neighbors' relief quickly soured into blame. Jim Parker spat into the mud, his face red with frustration. "This never would have happened if that dog was kept on a leash, or if folks weren't keeping monsters for pets." His voice was loud enough for the entire crowd, his words slicing through the fragile calm. Mrs. Nguyen bristled, stepping between Jim and Katie. "That's enough. Duke saved Daisy. You should be grateful." But others murmured agreement with Jim, their fear twisting into anger. One woman hugged her young daughter tight, glancing at Katie with open suspicion. "If that snake comes back, what about our kids, our dogs? Who's going to answer for it?" Another man, face lined with fatigue, shook his head. "I just want things back the way they were. We don't need more trouble out here." Katie felt the eyes of the whole town boring into her. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the mud. She was grateful when Chris spoke up, voice steady. "We'll set up a patrol, keep an eye out, but let's not start turning on each other. It's been a rough night for everyone." As animal control drove away with the python, neighbors slowly scattered. Some stopped to offer a brief, awkward word of support. "Hang in there, Katie," or "let me know if you need anything." But most avoided her gaze. She caught bits of muttered conversation as people walked away. She always was a little too attached to that dog. Should have called for help sooner. Could have been worse. When the last vehicle disappeared up the muddy drive, Katie slumped against the barn door, relief warring with humiliation. Daisy was safe for now, but the cow's eyes still rolled white, body trembling in shock. Katie left her with a bucket of water and an old blanket, then turned to Duke, who limped beside her back to the house. Inside, the world shrank to the quiet clatter of Duke's nails on the kitchen floor and the hiss of rain against the window. Katie set about cleaning Duke's wound, hands gentle but efficient. She'd patched up dogs and people alike back in her EMT days, but it was different when it was your own. Every time Duke flinched, Katie felt the ache in her own bones. She tried to distract him, talking softly as she stitched and cleaned. "You remember when you were just a rookie, Duke? You'd chase anything that moved, tail wagging the whole time. Now look at you. still a hero. But Duke's eyes stayed distant. As she worked, he tensed at every sound. A passing siren, the echo of thunder far off, the metallic scrape of the medkit. His breath came shallow, his whole body on edge. The kitchen felt colder than usual, shadows stretching across the floor. Katie's own nerves were raw. She thought of her late husband. His steady hands, his calm in a crisis. She missed him more fiercely in that moment than she had in months. She remembered his voice. Don't let people tell you what you and Duke can't do. Second chances are for the stubborn. But the judgment in her neighbor's eyes stung more than she cared to admit. When she finished, Duke curled up under the table, head on his paws, eyes squeezed shut. Katie stroked his fur, whispering thanks and apologies, half to him, half to herself. The storm outside was fading, but inside a new one had begun to brew. Later that afternoon, Katie's phone buzzed, a number she hadn't seen in years. Jenny, her old partner from the ambulance service. I heard about what happened. Don't let them get to you, Katie. Towns like that can eat you alive if you let them. You did the right thing. Katie bit back tears. It doesn't feel like it. They all looked at me like I was the problem, not the snake. Jenny's voice was gentle but firm. You're not the problem. People get scared. They need someone to blame. But Duke's still here. Daisy's still alive. That counts for something, even if they don't see it yet. Katie nodded, gripping the phone until her knuckles went white. Thanks, Jen. I'll try to remember that. As darkness fell again, Katie watched Duke sleep fitfully, his legs twitching with dreams only he could see. She sat up late into the night, haunted by what had happened, and what might still come. She couldn't shake the sense that something in both Duke and herself had been broken open by the night's events. A wound the town wasn't sure it wanted to heal. And somewhere out in the dark, the questions and the blame circled, waiting for another storm. The hours after the Python incident stretched thin and heavy, as if the farmhouse itself was holding its breath. Rain continued to drizzle, soft but persistent, muting the sounds of the outside world. Inside, Katie Morgan moved through the rooms like a ghost, tending to her chores with the automatic grace of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for too long. Even Daisy's soft, uneven moves in the barn seemed far away, as if muffled by the thick air and the layers of doubt pressing in from all sides. Duke lay on his old patchwork rug in the kitchen, one side bandaged, head resting on crossed paws. His eyes followed Katie with a haunted, almost apologetic devotion. Now and then, he'd twitch or let out a low whine, the ghosts of last night's violence still running wild behind his amber eyes. He startled at sudden noises, the slam of a cupboard, the tap of rain on the window, the distant wail of a siren from the highway. Each time, Katie's heart clenched. She knew what that haunted look meant. She'd seen it too many times in her EMT days, and again in her own mirror after she'd lost her husband. She found herself drifting to the little shelf above the stove, where an old photograph of her late husband smiled out from behind cracked glass. He was standing with Duke, both younger, brimming with a stubborn optimism. Second chances are for the stubborn, he used to say, ruffling Duke's ears and grinning at Katie until she laughed. No matter how rough the day. Now the house felt too big, too empty, even with Duke's gentle presence. She traced her finger over the frame, whispered, "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you?" Her phone buzzed again, a few texts from Jenny, a reminder about the vet coming by to check on Daisy, and beneath it all, a new round of neighborhood group messages. Some folks were offering cautious sympathy. "Hope Daisy's okay." but most sounded like thinly veiled blame. Any more news on the python? Kids are scared. Someone said animal control never saw a permit for that kind of snake in town. People are saying Duke's dangerous now, after what happened. Katie sighed and set the phone down. The town's mood had shifted from fear to suspicion, and the old anxiety gnawed at her. She'd always tried to keep her head down, not make waves. But it was different now, with her late husband gone and Duke both her family and her shield. She turned her focus to Duke. Sitting beside him, she ran her hands through his fur, feeling every tremor and flinch as she checked the stitches. "You're tougher than half the men in this county, you know that?" she murmured, forcing a smile. Duke gave a faint, grateful wag, but his tail stayed tucked. In the afternoon hush, she listened to the rhythm of his breathing, searching for comfort. Outside, the storm clouds began to thin, letting in streaks of watery light that fell across Duke's back, making the gray in his fur shine silver. Memories drifted back. Duke in his prime, bounding over obstacles in training, eyes sharp and eager, always the first to respond when his handler called. But Katie saw how he'd changed after her husband died, how he started waking in the night, barking at ghosts, limping more as if carrying a weight no one else could see. The trauma was always there, simmering beneath the surface just as it was for her. As evening approached, a car pulled up in the gravel drive. Katie opened the door to find Mrs. Nguyen standing there with a Tupperware of homemade pho, her face creased with worry. "For you and Duke," she said, holding it out, "and maybe a little comfort." Katie accepted it with trembling hands. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the air thick with quiet understanding. Mrs. Nguyen spooned broth into a bowl for Katie, then, after a quick, conspiratorial glance, ladled some for Duke, who licked at it gratefully. "I know what it's like to feel judged," Mrs. Nguyen said softly. "After my husband died, the town forgot how to talk to me. But you have to hold on. Sometimes people come around. Sometimes they don't. What matters is you know what's right." Katie blinked back tears. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, letting Duke be around so much trouble. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should have kept him inside, kept everyone safer." "Nonsense," Mrs. Nguyen cut in, a flash of fire in her eyes. "That dog saved your cow. Saved you, too. There are always people who blame the loudest voice, but most folks just need someone to follow. You be that someone." After Mrs. Nguyen left, Katie finished tending to Duke's wound, replacing the bandage and stroking his fur. "We're a pair, you and me. Broken, stubborn, and still here," she whispered. She settled into her favorite chair, Duke at her feet, and tried to relax, but the restlessness wouldn't let her go. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the python's cold, glassy stare, heard the rain hammering the barn roof, the neighbors' voices echoing judgment. Sometime after midnight, she sat by the window watching Duke dream. His legs twitched as if chasing something. Maybe the memories of a time before fear, or the shape of something he'd never catch. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Duke's ears perked, but he didn't move from her side. Katie rested a hand on his head, drawing comfort from the simple warmth. "We'll get through this," she promised, voice soft but determined. "No matter what they say, no matter what comes next." As dawn began to creep over the hills, the world felt quieter, but the storm inside Katie hadn't fully passed. She knew the peace was temporary, the kind of uneasy truce that comes before life demands another act of courage. But for now, in the stillness, woman and dog took solace in each other, a silent promise that neither was truly alone, no matter how fierce the storm or how long the night. The days after the attack crawled by in a fog of exhaustion and suspicion. Katie forced herself into a rhythm, checking Daisy every few hours, cleaning Duke's wound, keeping busy so she wouldn't have to dwell on the sideways glances she received at the feed store or the pointed silence from neighbors who used to wave. She tried to push it out of her mind, focusing on small wins. Duke's limp improving, Daisy eating again, a patch of sunlight on the kitchen floor that made the house feel alive. But the sense of being watched never left her. The town's mood had curdled. If a truck rumbled past her driveway too slow, Katie caught herself peeking out the window, heart tight, wondering if it was someone coming to blame her again. Then, on the third night, as the town tried to settle back into its old routine, the peace shattered. It started with a phone call from Mrs. Nguyen, her voice trembling on the other end of the line. "Katie, it's back. The python. It's been spotted at the Reynolds farm. Their goats are panicking, and nobody knows what to do. Some of the men are saying you brought this trouble here." Katie's gut twisted. "I'll be right there," she said, barely hearing her own voice. Duke, sensing her tension, was at her side before she hung up. Despite the ache in his leg, his eyes burned with determination, the kind of look he'd once had before a big call, back in his K-9 days. She grabbed her flashlight, the first aid kit, and a length of rope, whistling for Duke to follow. As she sped down the muddy back roads, the whole world seemed to tighten, headlights sweeping over sagging fences and anxious eyes staring from farmhouse windows. The Reynolds place was a chaos of noise. Goats bleating, flashlights darting through the darkness, people shouting over each other. Katie arrived to a tense crowd gathered at the edge of the pasture. Chris, the teen volunteer from the fire department, waved her over. "Thank God you're here. The python's cornered by the fence, but everyone's arguing. Some want to shoot, others are scared they'll hit a goat or spook the herd." Jim Parker's voice cut through the air. If she hadn't let that dog go wild, none of this would have happened. Now the whole town's at risk. He held his rifle ready, scowling at Katie as she approached. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, others glaring, a few looking away in shame. Mrs. Nguyen rushed to Katie's side, clutching her hand. "They're scared, Katie, but I trust you and Duke." Her words steadied Katie's nerves. She knelt by Duke, meeting his gaze. "Ready, old friend?" Duke wagged his tail, muscles coiled. Chris spoke up, trying to corral the chaos. "Let's keep it together. We need a plan. Who's actually seen the snake?" A farmer's wife stepped forward, voice shaking. "It's huge. I saw it slither behind the woodpile. The goats went crazy. My son almost ran right into it." Her little boy, clinging to her side, stared wide-eyed at Duke. Katie swallowed her own fear and took charge. "We need to keep the animals back and give the snake a path out, or it'll just get more aggressive. Nobody shoot unless there's no choice. Chris, you and Mrs. Nguyen, help me move the goats. Jim, keep everyone behind the fence." Jim bristled but complied, perhaps realizing the tension was about to snap. As Katie and Mrs. Nguyen herded the goats away, Duke stalked the fence line, nose to the ground, ears pricked. The python appeared suddenly, impossibly long, glistening in the flashlight beams, coiled beside the woodpile. The crowd gasped, several people stepping back in alarm. Jim raised his rifle. "Now's our chance. Let me take it out." "No," Katie shouted. "You'll hit Duke or a goat or worse. Send the snake right at us. We need to corner it safely. Give me and Duke a shot." The standoff was tense, every breath heavy. Katie tossed a length of rope to Chris. If we can distract it, maybe we can get a loop around its neck. Duke advanced slowly, hackles raised, barking and feinting to draw the snake's attention away from the crowd. The python struck, fast, terrifying. Duke dodged, barking furiously, buying Katie the seconds she needed. Heart pounding, Katie crept closer, adrenaline making her hands steady. She threw the rope, missing once, then caught the python's thick neck on the second try. Chris lunged to help, pinning the tail. The python thrashed, whipping mud into the air, but Duke's relentless barking and darting confused it just long enough for Katie to tighten the rope. Mrs. Nguyen called out, "Careful, don't let it slip free." The chaos lasted minutes. Felt like hours. By the time they finally wrestled the python into a makeshift crate, everyone was shaking, breaths ragged. The goat herd huddled at the far end of the pasture, and the air buzzed with nervous energy. As the adrenaline faded, blame began to bubble again. Jim turned on Katie, voice cold. "I hope you're happy. Your dog's drawn that monster here twice now. If something happens to a kid or another animal, it's on your head." Katie bristled, but Chris spoke up, chest heaving. "Katie just saved your livestock, Jim, and so did Duke. If you want to blame somebody, blame the person who let a snake like this loose in our town, not the ones trying to fix it." Mrs. Nguyen put her arm around Katie, voice gentle but firm. "You did right. The town just needs time to remember what courage looks like." Katie looked down at Duke, muddy, panting, but alive. She squeezed his collar, feeling the tremor in his muscles, the loyalty burning through his exhaustion. "Come on, boy, let's go home." As she led Duke and her few allies back toward her truck, she felt the sting of every angry glance, every whispered accusation. But she also saw a few grateful faces, neighbors who knew the line between courage and recklessness, who saw Duke not as a threat, but as a protector. Back at home, Katie collapsed onto the porch, Duke's head in her lap. The town's fear and suspicion felt heavier than ever, but she clung to one truth. When the next crisis came, she'd stand with Duke, no matter how lonely that road might be. Somewhere, just out of sight, a storm was building again. Night fell over the town like a shroud, heavy with humidity and the unease of unfinished business. The air was thick with the threat of another storm, this time not of thunder, but of reckoning. Katie barely slept, drifting in and out of dreams where shadows slithered across the yard and voices whispered blame through the walls. Shortly after midnight, a frantic knock shattered the fragile calm. Katie jerked awake, heart hammering. Duke barked, his old strength returning as he scrambled to her side. At the door, Chris stood pale and wild-eyed, rain soaking through his jacket. "It's back! The python! It's at the McAllister farm! It's got one of the calves! Please, Katie, we need you and Duke." Katie was already grabbing her boots and first aid kit. Duke glued to her side, his limp forgotten. She didn't bother to think about the risk. She just moved, adrenaline taking over. "Let's go, boy," she whispered, feeling Duke's energy surge in response. They raced through the darkness, tires throwing up mud, windshield wipers beating out a frantic rhythm. Chris filled her in between sharp breaths. "We saw it by the creek. Looked like it was leaving, but then it doubled back. Caught a calf before we could get close. The men are scared to get near. Don't know if they should shoot. The vet's on his way, but Katie, that calf is gonna die if we don't move fast." When they arrived at the McAllister place, chaos greeted them. Shouting, flashlights swinging wildly, the air electric with fear and frustration. Mrs. Nguyen was there, face tight with worry but determined, standing beside the teenaged fireman, ready to help. In the field, the outline of a mother cow loomed, bawling in panic as her newborn calf thrashed on the ground. the massive python already half coiled around its tiny body. Katie's breath caught. The calf's legs kicked weakly, its eyes wide with terror. The python was relentless, muscles rippling as it tightened its grip, every second counting down toward tragedy. The men hesitated at the edge of the circle, some clutching rifles, others frozen by the sheer size and power of the snake. Duke snarled and strained at his leash. Katie knelt, looking him square in the eye. "You remember your training, right? We do this together." She fumbled in her kit for the emergency med pack, memories flooding back of old rescues and frantic calls, of Duke hauling victims from rubble or pinning down dangerous suspects. "You distract, I'll free the calf, Mrs. Nguyen, Chris. Keep the lights on us. If it lunges, yell." Duke surged forward, barking louder than Katie had ever heard, his voice the command of a dog who remembered being a hero. The python's head snapped up, tongue flicking, body pausing in its relentless squeeze. Katie darted in, shovel in hand, aiming for the spot just behind the snake's head. Chris flanked from the other side, wielding a heavy branch. "Now, Duke," Katie called. Duke leapt forward, teeth bared, snapping at the python's tail. The snake recoiled, loosening its grip just enough for Katie to wedge the shovel between its coils and the calf's body. With a wild, desperate cry, she pushed with all her strength. The calf kicked, freeing one trembling leg. The python spun, striking toward Duke, who darted back, feinting and barking, drawing its attention away from the humans and the terrified calf. The seconds stretched. Every move was a risk. Every breath could be the last. Chris shouted, "Watch out!" as the python lunged again, this time catching Duke along his flank. Duke yelped but didn't falter. Instead, he grabbed a med pack from the open truck door, clamped it in his jaws, and limped toward Katie. A move that stunned even Chris, who muttered, "He remembers. He really remembers." Katie seized the med kit with one hand, her other hand wrapped around the struggling calf. She tore open the pack, working by flashlight, adrenaline giving her the precision of an EMT on the edge. Mrs. Nguyen and Chris worked together, circling the snake with makeshift poles, yelling and shining lights in its eyes. The snake, overwhelmed and confused by the noise and motion, finally released the calf with a violent thrash, slithering toward the darkness. But Duke wasn't done. He blocked the python's escape, barking and lunging until at last, headlights swept across the field. The vet had arrived, his old pickup bouncing down the rutted lane. The vet wasted no time, joining Katie to check the calf, quickly injecting a sedative to ease its shock. "You got here just in time," he said breathlessly. "If it weren't for Duke..." Duke collapsed beside Katie, panting hard, blood streaking his fur, but eyes burning with pride. Katie pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "You did it, old boy. You saved another life." The team worked fast, the tension dissolving into exhausted relief as the vet confirmed the calf would recover. The men in the field, once so eager to shoot, now stared at Duke in awe. Jim Parker approached, shame coloring his features, and knelt to rub Duke's ears. "You're a damn hero, you know that?" He looked up at Katie, words catching in his throat. I was wrong. About you. About him." Katie nodded, too tired for anger, too grateful for resentment. Around them, the community pulled together. Someone helped bandage Duke's wounds. Another guided the calf and its mother back to the barn. Mrs. Nguyen squeezed Katie's hand, eyes bright with tears. Chris surveyed the battered group. "That snake's finished. Animal control can take it from here. You saved the day, Katie. You and Duke." As the adrenaline faded and the sky began to lighten, Katie watched her battered, brilliant dog limp alongside her toward the truck. She knew the road ahead would still be rough, the town slow to forgive, the wounds on both sides slow to heal. But tonight, against the odds, they'd saved a life. Maybe, she thought, they'd saved each other too. Duke leaned against her, tail wagging, gaze steady and true. For the first time in a long while, Katie felt something new take root in her chest, a fierce, unyielding hope. Word spread quickly after the rescue at the McAllister farm. By morning, news of Duke's heroism and the second python attack had swept through the town like wildfire. The local Facebook group buzzed with photos of the calf, wrapped in a blanket beside its grateful mother, and blurry cell phone videos of Duke lunging fearlessly at the monstrous snake. In the comments and on every porch, the debate raged hotter than ever. Some neighbors praised Duke, calling him the bravest soul in the county. Others doubled down on their suspicion, whispering that trouble seemed to follow Katie Morgan and her unpredictable dog. At the general store, a handwritten flyer announced a special town hall meeting to discuss safety, responsibility, and what's best for our community. Underneath, someone had scrawled in red marker, "Is Duke a hero or a liability?" Katie barely slept the night before, nerves gnawing her insides raw. She bandaged Duke's wounds again, tracing each new scar with trembling hands, and whispered, "No matter what they say, I know the truth, old friend." Duke wagged his tail, a little slower than usual, but with unwavering trust. That evening, the community center parking lot overflowed with trucks and muddy boots. People filed in, faces tight with anticipation. Chris and Mrs. Nguyen met Katie at the door, offering silent support. "We're with you," Mrs. Nguyen whispered, squeezing Katie's hand. Inside, the tension crackled like a downed power line. Folding chairs lined up in tight rows, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder. On the stage, the mayor, an aging man in a battered suit, called the meeting to order, his gavel barely audible over the murmurs. "First up," he began, "we need to address what happened this week and decide how to keep our town safe. We'll hear from those involved. Then everyone gets a say." Jim Parker was the first to stand, clearing his throat. His voice, usually so sure, wavered as he faced the crowd. "I'll admit, I was wrong about Duke. I saw him save that calf with my own eyes. And Katie, well, she put herself between us and that snake more than once. But we can't ignore that this never used to happen. Someone brought that monster here, and we need answers." A murmur swept the room. Agreement, resentment, fear. The mayor nodded, then looked at Katie. "Mrs. Morgan, would you like to speak?" Katie stood, her hands shaking but her chin high. "Duke protected this town, protected your animals, your families, when nobody else could. I know some of you blame me. Maybe it's easier than facing the real problem. Someone brought an illegal animal into our community, and whoever did it is still out there. If you want to find the real threat, start there." Someone scoffed from the back. "She's right. We've all heard rumors about folks keeping things they shouldn't." Another voice. "But how do we know Duke's not part of the problem? What if he snaps one day?" Chris rose, face red with emotion. "You didn't see what I saw. Duke risked his life for us, again and again. He's no threat unless you're a snake. We need more dogs like him, not fewer." Mrs. Nguyen added, "Blaming Katie or Duke won't make us safer, but working together, watching for signs of trouble, looking after our neighbors, will." For a tense moment, the room teetered between division and unity. Then a new voice, timid but urgent, spoke up. I saw a truck out by the old Miller place last week. Someone unloading a big crate late at night. Thought it was odd, but I didn't say anything." Heads turned. Another neighbor chimed in. I saw the same truck a few days ago near my property. Didn't want to get involved. Suddenly, the story changed. Suspicion shifted from Katie to the shadowy figure in the truck. The mayor frowned. Sounds like we have a lead. I'll call the sheriff first thing tomorrow. As relief rippled through Katie, Jim Parker did something nobody expected. He crossed the floor and offered his hand. I'm sorry, Katie, for what I said and for not trusting you or Duke. The room fell silent as Katie shook his hand, gratitude and surprise warring on her face. Before the meeting ended, the sheriff's deputy burst through the doors, radio crackling. We got a tip. Animal control tracked down a man selling exotic pets out by the highway. Found crates, paperwork, everything. Looks like he's been dumping snakes for months. Gasps and murmurs swept the hall. Katie felt her knees go weak with relief. Chris grinned, pumping his fist in the air. Told you, it wasn't Duke or Katie. It was somebody treating our town like a dumping ground. The mayor banged his gavel for attention. Let's set the record straight. Duke is not a liability. He's a hero. And Katie, you have our thanks. We'll see to it that the real culprit faces justice. By the end of the night, the tone had shifted. Neighbors lined up to thank Katie and scratch Duke's ears. Even those who'd been the most suspicious seemed ashamed of their earlier accusations. Mrs. Nguyen beamed, pressing a bouquet of wildflowers into Katie's hands. You showed them what courage looks like, she said. On the way home, Chris jogged beside Katie's truck, breathless with hope. You know, Duke's kind of a legend now. Maybe you too. Katie laughed, the sound raw but real, and reached down to stroke Duke's graying muzzle. For the first time in weeks, the town felt less like a jury and more like a family learning how to heal. And somewhere on the wind, as the last light faded over the fields, Katie heard the echo of her late husband's words. Second chances are for the stubborn. After the storm of accusation and fear, the town settled into a quieter season, the kind where sunlight crept a little further into the kitchen each morning, and the air smelled more of fresh grass than suspicion. It wasn't a perfect peace. The scars of what happened lingered in the way folks glanced at the ditch, or the unease that flickered across a neighbor's face when a stick in the road looked just a little too much like a snake. But things had changed. Katie felt it first in the small things. The first week after the town hall, she caught a group of neighborhood kids leaving flowers on her porch with a hand-scrawled note. Thank you, Duke. You're our hero. The sight made her eyes sting and her heart ache with something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope. Daisy's recovery became a story of its own. Local legend wrapped in a cow's gentle brown eyes and the steady, healing hands of the town's only former EMT. Katie knew she couldn't keep going alone, not really. With Mrs. Nguyen's encouragement, she put up a flyer at the post office. Support group for anyone dealing with trauma, loss, or fear. All welcome. Pets too. The first meeting was small. A quiet Vietnam vet with a limp. A single mom whose boy still woke up screaming from nightmares. Mrs. Nguyen and her little rescue dog. And Chris, whose voice sometimes trembled when he talked about the fire he'd seen last summer. Katie opened her door, put on a pot of coffee, and let Duke curl up by their feet. Nobody needed to talk if they didn't want to. Sometimes, just knowing you were allowed to show up was enough. Word spread quietly, the way hope always does. By the end of the month, the living room was packed with townsfolk, farmers, teenagers, a retired deputy, a grandmother who'd lost her house to a tornado a decade back. People brought stories, casseroles, photographs, and more dogs than Katie thought possible. She started every meeting the same way. You're not alone. We're all healing in our own ways. Even Duke has his scars. Duke became the symbol for it all. He moved slower now, his limp a little more pronounced, but he carried himself with a dignity that even the toughest old ranchers respected. When the group got too quiet, Duke would make the rounds, nudging a trembling hand or thumping his tail against someone's leg, a reminder that comfort could be simple and wordless. More than once, someone broke down and sobbed into his thick fur, and left feeling lighter for it. The sheriff and the mayor, once worried about blame and lawsuits, started coming to meetings. They listened to the stories, apologized for the town's fear, and offered help where they could. Katie felt the old weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by something stronger, the feeling that she belonged again. As summer turned to fall, the town organized a Duke Day celebration. The idea started as a joke on social media. He's done more for this town than most mayors, but it caught on fast. On a warm Saturday, neighbors from miles around set up tables in the park. Homemade pies, lemonade stands, a pie-eating contest that ended with Mrs. Nguyen triumphantly crowned Queen of Lemon Meringue. Someone printed T-shirts with Duke's face on the front and the words, "Not all heroes wear badges," across the back. Katie watched it all with awe. Jim Parker manned the grill, laughing with the same teenagers who'd once jumped fences in panic. Chris organized a field day for the kids, even convincing the sheriff to referee a sack race. The local vet offered free checkups for pets, calling Duke the Grand Marshal of the parade. Daisy, decked out in a garland of wildflowers, became the unofficial mascot. At the center of it all was Duke, ears perked, tongue lolling, graciously accepting every scratch and treat offered by his admirers. When Katie wheeled him onto the little stage, the old injury in his hip making walking too tough for the long day, the crowd erupted in cheers. The mayor handed her a plaque for bravery, loyalty, and healing a divided town. Katie wiped away tears as she spoke, voice trembling but strong. When you love something or someone enough to risk everything, that's not trouble. That's what community is supposed to be. Duke didn't save this town alone. We all had a part. I hope we remember that when the next storm comes. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, neighbors lingered in the park, swapping stories and recipes, letting the kids chase fireflies in the warm grass. Katie sat beside Duke, feeling the beat of his steady heart and the comfort of belonging. Mrs. Nguyen sat down next to her, handing over a plate of pie. "You did good, Katie. You and Duke both." Katie smiled, watching as Chris showed the new puppy owners how to train their dogs with kindness, not fear. She saw the once suspicious faces of her neighbors softening in the golden light, saw forgiveness flicker and catch like fire in the summer breeze. She realized that the wounds, on the land, in the community, inside her and Duke, weren't gone, but they were healing. And maybe that was enough. The scars, after all, were proof of survival, of lessons learned, of love that held through the worst nights. As the first stars pricked through the sky and laughter drifted up into the quiet Texas air, Katie knew that the real legacy of that terrible storm wasn't fear or suspicion, but resilience and the fierce, ordinary courage that binds people and dogs together. No matter what tomorrow brought, they'd face it as a community. And for the first time in a long while, she was ready. After the noise of Duke Day faded, the town slowly returned to its rhythms. Yet for Katie, Mrs. Nguyen, Chris, and the little support group, the experience had opened wounds and, surprisingly, windows of understanding. As summer burned into a golden autumn, the farm took on a quieter magic. The shadows were longer, but the light somehow gentler, less full of suspicion. Katie found herself with time at last to reflect on what these months had truly meant. In the beginning, Katie thought she understood trauma. She'd lived through her husband's illness, his death, the isolation that followed. She'd seen it in Duke, too, those months after his K9 days ended, when he would wake yelping from dreams only he could see, limping to her bed and pressing close for comfort. Both had been changed by what they'd lost, left with scars that never fully faded. But it wasn't until the python came to the farm that Katie realized how easily pain can circle back, how old fears resurface when something new threatens the world you're trying to rebuild. At first, the town saw only the danger, the python, the storm, the risk. It was easier to blame the thing they didn't understand. A widowed woman, a damaged dog, the idea that something broken could be trusted to protect. Katie felt every icy glance, every whispered word at the feed store or church. And Duke, sensitive to her moods as ever, became even more vigilant, restless at night, quick to bark at shadows, always pressing himself between Katie and any visitor. But as the days passed and the support group grew, something unexpected took root. People who had never spoken of their own pain began to share. The Vietnam vet described the night terrors that still woke him, 40 years after the jungle. The single mom admitted how guilt ate at her every time her son flinched at thunder. Chris confessed to a deep fear he was no hero, haunted by a single moment of panic during a house fire. Each story echoed, in its own way, the struggles Katie faced with Duke. It became clear. Trauma isolated people, yes, but it could also forge bonds. Healing was rarely a solo act. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting in a room with others who understood, even when no one spoke at all. Katie saw this in Duke most of all. His injury had changed him. He'd never run as fast as he once did, and the old spark in his eyes was tinged now with wisdom and caution. But he found new purpose in his slower days, shepherding the lost and lonely just as he had once chased down criminals. He could sense distress, curling up beside anyone shaking or weeping, giving his warmth and presence freely. In those quiet evenings, Duke's calm was a salve for raw nerves, proof that patience and loyalty mattered more than perfection. Katie realized her own journey mirrored Duke's. For months, she'd measured herself against what she used to be, a fearless EMT, a wife, a neighbor with a full house and an easy smile. But loss had hollowed her out, left her unsure of her place. It wasn't until she allowed herself to grieve openly, to accept that her value didn't rest on being flawless or unafraid, that she began to feel whole again. Slowly, respect returned. Neighbors waved as they drove by. Invitations to potlucks arrived in her mailbox, and folks brought their animals for advice or first aid tips. The suspicion was still there sometimes, but it no longer defined her. More importantly, she no longer defined herself by it. One chilly evening, after a support group meeting, Katie found herself on the porch with Mrs. Nguyen and Chris. The vet, now a regular attendee, sipped coffee nearby as Duke sprawled between them, snoring contentedly. "It's funny," Chris mused, "how something that scared us so bad, something that almost tore the town apart, ended up bringing everyone together." Mrs. Nguyen nodded. "People forget how strong they are, until they see someone else standing up to the dark. Sometimes courage is just refusing to give in to fear, even when everyone else does." Katie looked at Duke and smiled. "I used to think I had to fix everything by myself, that I had to be strong, or else I'd let my husband down. But Duke, he taught me that real strength is showing up for others, even when you're scared, even when you're hurt." Chris raised his mug. "To second chances, then," for people, for dogs, for towns. Mrs. Nguyen laughed, clinking her cup against his, and to stubbornness, the good kind. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night wind in the trees, the peace hard-won but now unmistakable. Later, as Katie locked up and called Duke inside, she reflected on the long journey. The python had been more than a danger. It had been a mirror, forcing everyone to confront what they were most afraid of: loss, failure, being misunderstood. But it also gave them the opportunity to act with empathy, to look past fear and see the value in loyalty, patience, and second chances. Katie knew she and Duke would always bear their scars, but she also knew, finally, that scars were not signs of weakness, but of survival. The wounds proved they'd faced darkness and chosen hope again and again. When she tucked Duke into his bed and turned off the light, she whispered, "Good night, hero." And as she drifted to sleep, she understood that real redemption isn't a single act, but a life spent helping others find their way home, no matter how broken, no matter how lost. The town, once divided, had become a little more whole. And for Katie and Duke, that was the truest victory of all. Sometimes, the most powerful changes in a town happen so gradually, you only notice when you pause and look back. For Katie Morgan, life after the python attacks wasn't about a single act of heroism or the celebration that followed. It was the quieter shifts, the way fear gave way to compassion, the way suspicion softened into trust, and the way every scar, seen and unseen, became part of a story much larger than any one person or dog. That first morning after Duke Day, Katie stood on her porch with a cup of coffee, letting the breeze ruffle her hair. The land looked different, more familiar but also transformed. Sunlight glinted on the wet grass where the storm's memory lingered, and the fields echoed with the sound of distant cattle and the laughter of children waiting for the school bus. Duke limped up to join her, moving slowly but with his head held high. Together they watched as life continued, shaped but not defined by what had happened. Katie thought about all the moments where she'd nearly given in to despair, when the neighbors' whispers grew sharp, when the blame felt too heavy to bear, when even her faith in Duke trembled under the weight of other people's fears. But every time something had pulled her through: a neighbor's kindness, a child's note, a friend's steady support. In those moments, she learned that courage wasn't always about charging into danger. Sometimes it was just refusing to let the darkness win. She also understood now that forgiveness of herself, of her town, even of the ones who'd lashed out in fear, wasn't a one-time thing. It was a practice, a choice made over and over. Every day she saw reminders of the journey: the vet who now volunteered extra hours at the animal shelter, Mrs. Nguyen hosting her own story nights, where people shared memories and laughter alongside bowls of steaming pho, Chris taking a leadership role with the youth, teaching them that bravery often looked like kindness. As for Duke, his story became part of local legend. Children drew his picture in crayon and chalk, their scrawled notes pinned to the bulletin board at the feed store. "Duke saved us. Thank you for helping the calf." Sometimes Katie would catch an elderly rancher giving Duke an extra treat, or hear someone explain, "He's the reason I started checking in on my neighbors again." In a town that had nearly turned its back on them both, Duke had become a bridge between old wounds and new beginnings, between suspicion and understanding. One afternoon, as fall leaves began to swirl across the yard, Katie got a call from a neighboring county. The woman on the line spoke quietly, asking if Katie could come speak to a group of families who'd lost pets to a wildfire. "We heard about what happened in your town," she said. "We need hope, and it sounds like you found some." Katie hung up, heart full, and looked down at Duke. "Come on, hero," she whispered. "Looks like there's more work to do." She and Duke made that trip, and many others after. At each stop, Katie told the truth, that healing from trauma was messy and slow, that community was sometimes just the courage to stand by someone when everyone else steps away. She spoke about second chances, about refusing to give up on an old dog or a wounded heart, about how forgiveness often required more bravery than any rescue ever could. The impact spread. People who'd once hidden their pain began to show up for each other. The sheriff's office set up regular check-ins for elderly neighbors and started a hotline for animal welfare. Even those who had been slow to accept change found themselves drawn in, changed by the quiet insistence of kindness. In quiet moments, Katie reflected on what it all meant. She remembered the words her husband used to say. "We all have moments when the world turns against us, when every choice feels like the wrong one. But courage, whether it's a dog facing a snake or a woman standing up for what she believes, can turn a crisis into a catalyst for hope." Those words had sounded simple before, but now they rang with the truth only hard-won experience can bring. Sometimes she still woke at night, heart pounding, hearing echoes of thunder and the cow's terrified bellow. Sometimes Duke would whimper in his sleep, haunted by memories that would never fully fade. But they'd both learned something vital, that scars, whether in fur or in the heart, were not the end of the story, but proof of endurance, resilience, and love. The community changed, too. More people reported animal abuse, stray dogs found homes, and old feuds faded as folks realized what really mattered. On the anniversary of the first storm, the town gathered again, this time not out of fear, but out of gratitude. Stories were shared, laughter flowed, and a sense of belonging bound the people together in ways that wouldn't have seemed possible before. Katie took the stage, Duke beside her, and spoke to the crowd. "You all know what we've been through. We can't erase the storms or the pain or the mistakes, but we can choose what we do next. We can be each other's courage. We can make this town the kind of place where no one stands alone." She looked out and saw in the faces before her the answer: forgiveness, understanding, hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Katie felt at peace. She understood, at last, that while life would always hold more storms, she and Duke, and everyone else who'd been part of this journey, had learned how to weather them, together. And for anyone listening, whether in the little Texas town or far beyond, the story stood as a quiet invitation. Maybe your Duke is out there. Maybe you're someone's Katie. Either way, it's never too late to stand between fear and hope and find your way back, no matter how lost you've felt.